Hi everybody, Kevin here. Today I'm going to talk about some of the most requested topics, which has really been surrounding particles and how to manage systems when they get complex, especially for projects that are, a bit more directed than like an abstract sort of visualizer system. I love making those, but a lot of times clients want a sort of particle look that uses very directed motion and keyframing and animation. So we're going to cover a little bit of everything, really focusing around how to control a particle system that has multiple components and using some of the stuff we went over last time with system modifiers to make some of that control a little easier. So let's get started. So I'm going to start from scratch here, and to keep this one fun and interesting, my idea was to have this scene where a bullet shoots through a hand, and we're going to particle it out and make it look like it's this really kind of VFX and schematics style. So first, I like to bring in models occasionally, and although I don't do a whole lot of 3D modeling myself, there's a lot of really great assets out there that you can use to really take your particle systems to the next level, giving them some type of form or structure. So I'm going to use these two models here, and you can get them from this guy called the French Monkey, and I'm going to give him a huge shout out. So this is our bullet and this is our hand. He's got a lot of freebies here that I find, have been kind of helpful in random occasions. And the assets that I used for this one came from this TFM style asset pack, and he's got a lot of really great stuff in here. So highly recommend you check it out if you want some fun stuff to play with. Let's get on with it here. I've already imported these two models, bullet, and for some reason the hand is named Mom, but let's start with our particle system. As you know, most particle systems begin with a particle root, so we're going to add one of those. And because we're using objects here, let's go ahead and create a mesh emitter. A lot of times when I'm testing something real quick, I'll just use a primitive emitter. But as you get into, I imagine, more client projects, a lot of them will provide models and things like that because they want a very specific stylization to it. So let's go ahead and load our bullet. And if we plug this into our mesh render like so, that's kind of, you'll notice the mesh render changed from that red crosshatch right into a sort of what I consider valid node. So the mesh render doesn't work without some type of input. And to just visualize it, real quick, let's take a look here. So there's our bullet. Before we get too far, one thing that I always find myself needing to do with particle systems is to first toggle this fixed update rate. You don't have to do this, but for me, when I'm working on projects, I find this really helps make things more reproducible. And I typically match my update frame rate to whatever your project frame rate is. So I'm going to pick 60 for now. And I'm also going to lock down my project frame rate to 0.60. I already did that, but I think by default it's 999. So I'm going to go ahead and change that maximum to 60. And that way, as you play it, it will always play at the same speed every time. Otherwise, if you don't use this fixed update rate, what happens is your simulation speed kind of wanders up and down depending on how your system is performing. And you might get some, unexpected results, not necessarily bad, but just you'll have a little more difficulty keeping things consistent. So yeah, back to this bullet. So right now, by default, the mesh emitter emits on vertices. And, that's kind of a cool look. I'm going to go for something that's more spread out on this object, maybe like edges. We'll use some edges, or we could also try polygons and take a look at what that looks like. So you can see polygons fills out a lot more, but you get a slightly more random distribution of particles. So you know what, I think for this one I'm going to stick with vertices. I think I like the sort of order that it gives, right? And by default, the point render, as you can see, renders these kind of square sprites. Let's change that. I've imported this circle.dds that Notch gives with part of their sample pack. If I go through and import it again, it's you can find it in documents, and then Notch sample projects, and then they have a folder of sample resources here. You can definitely make your own circle. I just always tend to go here just for really basic stuff. So if we choose the circle DDS, you'll see I've imported it again. I'm gonna just merge resources by file name since I already had one, and we'll go ahead and use that circle.dds. So now you'll see all of a sudden all your point renders change to circles. A little more organic. They also have a circle that's got like a gradient fall off if you want something a little softer on the edge. So, right off the bat, we're already getting some type of form. Let's also go ahead and add the hand and kind of start structuring our scene in some way, right? So right now we're running into this issue where, okay, we have one emitter that's emitting a certain number of particles on this mesh that we've fed it. And now we're adding a second. So right off the bat, we already have two emitters. And the best, like, you might be tempted to make two particle roots and kind of separate your systems. I try not to do that for two reasons. One is that, it's easier to manage your overall node graph if you have one area where you have particles going on. The other reason I don't like to separate them is you won't be able to have as many interactions between your emitters. I really like keeping everything in one particle root because it lets me use effectors between multiple emitters or have emitters morph and shift between shapes and things like that. So it gives you a lot more flexibility as you start animating and trying to do cool things with your scene. So I'm going to go ahead and feed in this hand object as well into our mesh emitter. And you can see right away both objects have kind of appeared overlapping on each other. Because these 3D objects aren't linked to anything, they don't have what you could consider positional data at the moment. I also like to, when I load meshes, give these a null that I'll use to ultimately place these objects. So let's go ahead and do that. And you'll notice when I add the null, the mesh itself actually appears because now it's a rendered object. If you want it to be just particles and not show the mesh itself, you can go into here and under your object attributes, you can take this visible slider, and we reduce this to 0, you'll notice they disappear. So that's a great way to engage a mesh, but then be able to hide it and do other stuff with it. So, our bullet right now is at, if we pause this and show the grid, 0, 0. And so let's move our hand off to, well, let's check our axes first. So red, RGB, right? So red is X, green is Y, and then blue is Z. So right now our bullet's kind of facing us. I prefer to, in this scene, have things travel in the X-axis. It's up to you how you want to do that. There's no right answer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my object and rotate it by -90 degrees, it looks like. And that way my bullet's kind of facing to the right. And I'm going to move my hand over to the right a little bit here. And then, try to orient it so that the palm is kind of pointing towards my bullet. I think it'd be cool to make it look like the hand's kind of catching it. So I'll take this heading and just start rotating it. Oops, wrong way. Almost there. Okay, cool. So it's kind of pointing towards the palm. It's a little hard to see, but I think that's okay for now. If you noticed, I did sort of my rotations on the object itself, and I'm doing my offset on this null. And I don't have a really good reason why I like doing that. I think it's because I like to think of this as an object-specific property like rotation. And then once I've given it the orientation that I want, I can then use this null that's aligned with my world axes to really accurately place this thing where I want it to be. So that way my axes always align between multiple objects. It's just a small personal preference thing. So I'm going to go ahead and move this hand somewhat far away. We'll come back to that later. I'm going to put a distance of 20, which is quite far, as you can see. But that'll give us some time to let this bullet travel before it gets into the region of kind of striking our hand. So let's focus on our bullet for now, right? It's not doing a whole lot at the moment. We're going to need to animate it moving from left to right. So, let's go ahead and set up a control for that. So I'm going to create this envelope modifier, and I'm just going to go ahead and rename this envelope modifier here to bullet, let's see, bullet movement. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to control this null's X position with my bullet movement modifier here. And, from my system control tutorial, I like setting these to multiply and setting a maximum in the item that I'm controlling. So I want my bullet to kind of start at 0 where it is right now. And when this value goes to 1, I want this bullet to get into the striking region of his hand. So if I make this match that X position, this bullet should now be where the hand is. And so as I move this bullet from 0 to 1, it should basically fly along this trajectory towards the hand. So right away, we've kind of made a bullet movement parameter. So that's great. You know, if you try moving that around right now, you'll see that it kind of spawns particles as it goes, but the effect isn't quite there because the particles just kind of appear in our static. So we can start to look at how do we make these particles move and make them a bit more interesting. So right away, we can go back into our mesh emitter, and there's some really cool properties in here that I like to play with. Parent transform weight. What that means is when this particle is spawned, does it move with wherever this vertice on the mesh moves to? So as our mesh moves, right, this parent transform weight tells the particles to essentially follow the point from which they've appeared or were born. And you know, you can think of it like a child, and this mesh is its parent. So does it transform with its parent? And if we increase this weight a little bit and we move this bullet, you'll notice that the particles, you know, kind of stick to this bullet, which is a really cool effect for making it feel like this bullet is leaving traces in the air. You'll notice that they stick kind of uniformly, and real life doesn't really work that way. So to make it a bit more realistic, there's another parameter down here called parent transform randomness. And what that means is it'll randomize the amount that these particles are weighted to follow the parent, and you get a little more dispersion as this bullet travels. And already you can see it's starting to look quite a bit more natural. So that's a pretty cool look, you know. So that, to keep us from having to keep moving this slider, I feel like we should just go ahead and keyframe this, you know, not accurately for now, but just something to get us going here. So I'm gonna pause, go back to 0, which is home, click this K to drop a keyframe. Then a shortcut that I really like is if you hold down Shift, you can use left and right to jump by the second. If you look down here, you'll notice we're jumping by seconds. If you don't hold Shift, you jump by frames, basically. So let's say I jump like, I don't know, 5 seconds into the future, and then let's go ahead and drop another keyframe at 1. So when I drop keyframes, I'll enter a value, and then I'll hit enter twice to tell it to make a key. I don't like it to auto key for me, so I've turned off this AK or auto key option. What that means is I'm used to Cinema 4D, where before it drops a keyframe, I can adjust this value to see where it ends up. And if I don't tell it to take a keyframe, it won't automatically take a keyframe. I think by default auto key is on. And what happens is when you change this value, like if I turn auto key on real quick, when you change this value, the moment you change it, you'll notice it placed a keyframe automatically for you. And I don't like that. I like to test it out before I make up my mind. So when I turn that off, what I'll do is I'll type in a value, and when I hit enter, it'll move it to that position. And then if I hit enter again, it'll drop a keyframe. So I like having that confirmation basically before I drop a keyframe, and you'll notice it turned green. And if we want to double check where our keyframes are, we can go into our timeline layer view. And if you hit F2 to go to that, and you hit F2 again, it'll actually reveal the node that you have selected, and it'll show you these 2 keyframes you've just dropped. Twiddle that arrow down, you can see the ramp that it's on. And if you want to see more detail in this ramp, you can go to F3, which is the curve editor, right? And here, if you hit F3 again, it'll locate this value that you've just tuned, basically. And I'm going to go ahead and solo it so you can see it. The shortcut A kind of locks it to frames, so you can see here we're going from 0 to 1 in about 5 seconds. So that's great. We just made our first keyframe animation. I'm jumping through that a little quickly, but you know, maybe I'll go into a little more detail on some other tutorial. For now, you can see our bullet is flying from 0 to our hand, and some of these particles are kind of following it a little bit. So already we're starting to get a framework of this bullet flying towards the hand. So now let's look at perhaps stylizing some of this so that's a bit more convincing, you know, and maybe you want some of these to totally not follow the bullet completely. You can, you know, increase this randomness a bit more and play with these values to see what happens as you change them. So if I increase randomness and decrease transform weight, you'll notice it kind of leaves much more of a trail. But right now I notice immediately that this trail is very uniform, like it doesn't dissipate out at all, as you might expect from a bullet path. And we can do that by giving it a little bit of emission normal direction velocity. These two parameters are also really fun to play with in your mesh emitter. Let's try this normal direction velocity. You'll notice right away it dissipates outwards quite a bit more. And so that gives it a lot more of this sort of bullet feel. And if we, combine a little bit of transform weight with this dissipation, you'll get this really cool kind of like visualization of what's happening in the air around it. And that's really cool and fun already. As we're doing this though, I noticed that it's a little hard to tell that this is a bullet. It kind of just looks like a comet. So, to maintain this sort of schematic view, what we can do is go into this bullet object and we can go into this lines tab here. So instead of rendering the mesh, and getting this white glob, we can instead show some of the lines that are on the bullet in the mesh, and that might give it a sort of cooler schematic effect like you see here. Right, so that I think matches with this sort of style well and helps illustrate more that there's a bullet. And we should also use color, I think, to differentiate between what the mesh is and what some of the particles are. So we can right away give this line work on the bullet its own color. Let's do like, I don't know, orangish. I think that's pretty cool. And we can decrease the alpha a little bit so that's kind of transparent. So now it looks really schematic-like, right? I think it's a really cool look there. And as it flies, now you can tell much more that it's a bullet. Another thing, as you're making scenes like this, it's important to remember what real life is like if that's what you're going after, is sort of realism. And one thing that I know about bullets is that they should spin as they travel in the air, right? So let's give this bullet some spin. That's not something that I really feel the need to keyframe since it's a sort of constant motion. And instead we could potentially use a continuous modifier to have this bullet continually spin. So we can either do that on the null or we can also do it on the object. To me, it makes more sense to do it on the object since we want to be able to, have this bullet spin, but then be able to move that after you know that the bullet is already spinning. I don't think it really matters which one you do it on, but hey, why not? So we're gonna tie this to, you can test out which one it is first. I believe it's bank here. Right, so we'll tie this continuous modifier onto the bank parameter. And the bullet's spinning, but it's really slow because this continuous modifier is only doing 1 degree, I think, per second. So if we increase the speed to say 10, we should be getting quite a bit more spin off of that. It's still a little hard to tell. Let's see. Okay, there, I see it a little bit now. So I think we should look at perhaps a trail render to better see this, or we can also increase the parent transform weight. Remember that this is going to follow the vertex that it's emitted from. So now you're starting to visualize a little bit of the spin as these particles stick with that spinning vertice. What we can do with the render, right, is if we add a trail render, that'll kind of show a path of where the particle has been, and it'll make it a little more clear how fast it's spinning. Right away, there's kind of too much going on there, so we should decrease the number of particles that emit a trail, and then we can also decrease the length of the trail. I'm going to use an age mode and then decrease this trail fade age and fade range. In general, I think your fade range should be less than your fade age. It's kind of at what age does your trail start fading? That's how I like to think about it. I'm not sure that's 100% correct, but it usually gives me good results. So, now we're able to visualize it a little bit more, right? We could potentially even spin this bullet even faster. Let's try like 40. So there you go. Now you're like really starting to see some of that spin. And as this bullet flies, we keep losing it out of our frame. I think we should add a camera and parent it to this bullet, and then we can track it a little better. So I'm going to go ahead and make a camera. And right now this bullet, this null is kind of this bullet control, right? So let's make another null and make that our sort of camera's parent. But then we can also make this null one of the children of this bullet control null. So if I make a little bit of room here and we disconnect this, or sorry, we can leave this connected. But what we can do is we can nest our camera inside of this traveling sort of bullet as well, and then just bring our camera back in the Z a little bit. So when we hit 6 and switch to our camera view, you can see now our camera is basically locked onto the path of our bullet. So if we switch back to orbit, you can see that our camera, as we play this, moves with the bullet. And this will make it a little easier for you to design, is if you just let this play, then we can basically track what this bullet looks like as it moves. And now you can really see the spin a lot better as these vertices move like that. So pretty cool, right? I think it could spin potentially even a bit more. So let's just increase this further. There you go. Now we're getting some really nice spin on that. Right off the bat, like, this is a little dense and washed out, so we can probably tone back this alpha a little bit, you know, make it a little transparent. And we could probably do the same with the point render. One thing that I think is really important with the point render to make it look a little more natural and organic is this size randomness. Right now you'll notice every single particle is the exact same size, and it makes it look a little artificial. So I would typically like to increase this randomness a little bit, and you'll see some of the particles get a little smaller here. And that just helps make this look a little more natural, since, hey, not all particles are made equal. And right there, you know, this is pretty cool already. Now I'd like to take a moment and talk about, you know, how do we add some color to this, right, and make it more interesting? Well, a lot of people will go right in their mesh emitter and set a color here. I don't typically like doing that, and the main reason is that it's a very uniform sort of coloring. I find it kind of boring. It doesn't reveal a whole lot to you about what is different in these particles here, like what differentiates this particle from this particle from that particle. You can't really tell. So I typically leave this mesh emitter on just white as what I think of a blank canvas to work with. And then I also see a lot of people go in and use this life color shading. And, you know, it's a pretty cool effect in that it colors by age. So if we go from, like, say, white to yellow to orange to red, it'll basically color these particles as they get older, right? So the older a particle is, the more red it's going to get. And that's also, you know, I'd say a pretty nice effect. My main complaint with the life color shading is you can only do 4 colors, right? If you want 5, you know, or just 2, you don't really have the flexibility to do that. And so one of the most awesome nodes that I've found and I use in every single particle system is attribute shading. And the reason I like using this over either of the other 2 options is the attribute shading node lets you input a color ramp. So if you haven't used a color ramp before, it lets you define as many colors as you want. So you can choose just 1 or 2 colors, or you can make this, you know, like a 12 color gradient. And so it gives you just a lot more flexibility in what sort of colors you want to make your particles. And your attribute shading itself also has a normalized life setting. And what that is a particle that was just born is considered 0, and a particle that's about to die is basically an age of 1 or a life of 1. And that's really great, because this is essentially life color shading, but with the option of using a lot more colors than just 4, or a lot fewer colors than just 4. And what's really cool about attribute shading too is you have a lot more selections in here, like velocity magnitude, so you can color particles based on how fast they are traveling, or velocity along a direction, right? Like velocity X, Y, Z, or along the direction that the particle is traveling. And so you can get some really cool effects with some of the settings in here. For now, we're just going to use normalized life, and we're going to use this color ramp to set some of the colors in it. One thing that I really recommend is presets. If you don't know a lot about presets, they're a way to basically quickly recall some settings, and I especially like using it for color ramps because it can take some time to like hone in on the colors that you want and find a palette that's sort of engaging. And you might spend a lot of time doing that. You might not be able to recreate cool color palettes you've made in the past. So if you ever make a cool color palette, I recommend just hitting this plus icon here and saving it into a preset. Or that way, once you've saved it, then you can always recall it at some later date. So I've spent some time and just made myself a bunch of presets. And that way I can really quickly dig through this and just, you know, like this is my fire preset, find some presets that I think might be interesting for coloring particles. And when you use this, you just have to make sure that you're using the right setting here and that your scale is something that makes sense for what your system is. One last thing that I think is kind of interesting is this attribute shading has a radius to it. So that's kind of within how far this attribute shading will actually have an effect. And because our bullet is traveling quite far, I'm gonna make this radius really large, like 1,000, and also my inner radius really large. So that way this attribute shading always has an effect no matter where the bullet is in our scene, at least within 1,000, right? And this color ramp, I think, might not be the best fit for this. I think you could use a little bit of tuning. I might make some of these colors a little bit lighter. So that's what's great about presets too. You may recall one and not like it. And so you have the ability to start from some sort of preset or template and then edit it a little bit into something that you like more. So I think I'm going to skew this towards a little more lighter tones. Right, so there we go. We're getting this kind of cool orange shading. And you can play with some of this scale and offset in here to change kind of which portion of your gradient it's sampling. So if I want a little bit more light tones in here, I can increase this attribute scale. And I can also now start to play with, like the life of my particles. Maybe I don't want them to live quite as long. And that way they'll kind of die off faster and trail for a little bit less. And I'll notice too, like for instance, there's a lot of tweaking that you can do. Like I feel like this trail render is probably a little too thick right now, so I could use it on even less particles. I want it to be almost kind of sparse, just a few sort of like trail feelings here. And that's pretty cool. Shading looks a little flat. One of everybody's favorite post effects in Notch is glow. If we add a little bit of that, it'll give it some pop, and we can start, adding some of these to start tuning like what we feel this scene should come out looking like. I think tuning this threshold here is really important to make sure that you're not just blowing everything out and giving it just that little bit of pop, right? So flat shading and a little bit of glow really helps bring out some life in the particles. I think that's really nice. Maybe a little bit more even, right? So cool, we've got some trails here. Some of the particles I feel like might be following a little too strongly. And then I want some of these to fly off even more. So I'm going to increase my normal velocity a little bit here. So that right now I think is a pretty cool effect. We can also step out of our camera and get a better idea of what this is starting to look like. And turn off my grid so you don't get that crosshair. So cool, here's our bullet, right? We can also potentially even add like some line connection render. It'll give it a little more of like a high-tech feel. And right off the bat, that's a little strong. So I'm gonna decrease the number of max line connections to, just like 3. And I'm also going to uncheck this use locality grid. I don't have a great way of explaining what this locality grid does. I think the best way is for you to experiment toggling on and off to see what happens. My gut feeling is that the locality grid kind of uses where the particles start from to make these connections, whereas turning it off uses wherever they end up being to create these line connections instead of where they're just starting from. And in some cases it can make it more sparse, in other cases it can make it more dense actually. And if you want these line connections to be longer, you can change this distance threshold so that you can see now these line connections reach a little bit further. So I kind of like that long connection, but I don't want so many. So again, you can use this particle use amount to just decrease how often that occurs. And maybe tune this particle alpha a little bit as well, right? So they're just a little bit transparent. Like it gets a little bit dense in here. I might just tone down the alpha in all of my settings just a little bit. Right, and here we're already starting to see a little bit of complexity. I mean, when I talk about particle system complexity, what I'm really talking about is just layering. The more things that you start to layer on, the more of a complex feel you're going to get. And instead of feeling like this simple thing, it really starts to come to life as you get a little bit of trails in here, a little bit of dots, a little bit of line connections. It starts to mesh together and form something that is really visually interesting. And if, another trick that I like to do when I want to make it even more layers is there's this really great and useful emitter called a trail emitter. And what that is it emits from particles that you've emitted. So it's kind of like this inception of particle emission. So you've emitted particles from the mesh, but then you can emit more particles from those particles you've just emitted. How I like to use these trail emitters is to hook them as a child of the emitter that you want them to act on. So this to me, visually speaking, makes a lot of sense, because first we're emitting from this mesh, and then we're emitting more from those particles that were emitted from that mesh. And if we go into this trail renderer here, there's a few settings in here right off the bat that I like to tune. The default is that there's no life randomness, so it'll kind of emit in like pulses, and I want it to emit sort of continuously without those pulses. So I typically bump this life randomness to 0.9, meaning the particles should be very random in terms of their lifetime. And what happens is that you get a much more even sort of emission of these particles. And another thing that I like to change here is I don't need 50 particles emitted for every original particle emitted. I'm going to tone that way down to like 4, it's just so it's less. And, as you add more emitters here, one problem that a lot of people run into is how do you keep track of how many particles you have? Like it's going to affect your system performance. You're going to hit ceilings on the sort of max particle counts here, as well as in your root node here, your number of particles. So what's a good way to, keep track of what's happening? One thing that I find really useful is in your particle root, there's this checkbox called show metrics. And if you check that, what it's going to do is it's going to give you a little printout of each of your emitters. And this first number is how many you've set for it in this max particle count. So 30,000 required or requested, I guess. It'll show you how many are active at this moment in time. So right now, there are 10,000 particles active for our first mesh emitter here. And then it'll give you an average count. So over time, roughly how many are active at any given moment, right? And you can use this number to better gauge, like, am I emitting enough particles, or am I allowing enough maximums so that I can emit that many particles? And one issue that I'm seeing right away is we've requested in total here 90,000 particles, but our particle root only allows for 64,000. So you're going to start to hit limits on some of these, and you're not going to be emitting how many particles you should expect. So right off the bat, I would just increase this. I wouldn't go too crazy with it, just be sensible with this number. I'm going to pick 250,000 right now, because that gives me a nice little bit of room above 90,000 here. And you'll notice, see right there, our number went from 5,000 to 18,000. So that'll tell you that we were being limited by our particle root. So when I'm working on particle systems, I kind of like to leave this on. I think it's a really nice guide for where you are in terms of system performance in your particle system and how much overhead room that you have left. So this also shows us our trail emitter is kind of hitting this ceiling quite quickly. So one thing we can do is just, decrease this max particles per source particle. Because this is 4, theoretically, like we should be emitting 4 times 30,000, which is 120,000 particles, which is a lot. I don't feel like you really need that many. So if I decrease that down to 2, we're probably still going to hit this ceiling quite quickly, but at least it'll be dispersed a little bit more amongst all those particles. And right here, I think these are some of the trail emitters that we're starting to see. You can also turn it off to see what changes, right? You'll notice that sort of center trail has disappeared. If I turn it back on, that center trail has returned. Just like in your mesh emitter, your trail emitter has a lot of interesting settings too. The same kind of stuff like parent transform weight, parent transform randomness. In this case, it's no longer referring to the mesh, but the particle that these trail emitters are emitting from. So similarly, we might also want to give this a little bit of like initial velocity tangent. That's kind of like velocity along the path of the original particle, the tangential path. And then you can also give it, velocity outwards as well. So that should, doesn't seem like it's doing a whole lot. Let me see. If we give it a little bit of transform weight, they should follow some of the source particles a little bit here. So you'll notice now they're starting to kind of like fizzle outwards a little bit, which is a pretty cool effect. Kramer, my cat, says hello. So, these particles are now following kind of their parent a little bit here. And what I like to do is, if you don't know what a parameter does, just go crazy with it, you know, make it some extreme value so that it'll show you what it's doing. And right now, like the fact that they're all colored the same isn't really helping our case. So let's talk a little bit about how to separate like our shading, for instance, per emitter and things like that. Pretty much every rendering and affector and shading node has an input called affected emitters. So like rendered emitters, rendered emitters, rendered emitters. This one has an affected emitters. And what that input is which emitters do I work on, right? So let's say we only want this sort of fire shading we've made to work on our bullet mesh emitter. We can feed this into this input here. And now this attribute shading won't affect any of our other emitters, like this trail emitter or our mesh emitter. So now you'll notice our trail emitter here has turned white. And I think that's a really good way to sort of QC and figure out what is actually going on and visually separate that from the other particles in our scene. So now as we play with these values, we should get a much better idea of like what's happening there. So I'm not seeing enough of this outwards velocity that I wanted, so I'm going to make this 10 and see what happens. So you'll see there it's kind of going crazy now, and now I have a much better idea of where I want that to potentially sit. So I don't like what this initial velocity is doing, so I'm going to turn that off and instead just use this parent transform weight. And as some of these parents fizzle outwards, these trail emitters should follow a little bit, basically. Looks like that's already kind of happening. I think it gives it this really nice like explosion sort of effect. And I might even push my original particles outwards even a bit more with this normal velocity. Right, so I think that's a pretty cool effect there. I might also decrease this randomness a little bit so we have a few that kind of stick to the bullet and are spiraling with it. And I think I took away too many trails perhaps. So as you can see, there's a lot of fiddling to figure out where's that sweet spot that you want to hit of visual appearance. And you know, to maybe make these trail emitters a bit more interesting, I don't think they necessarily need this trail render. So similarly, we can use that same input to tell it only render trails for our mesh emitter, not for our trail emitter here. So you're already seeing like quite a stark difference between our trail emitter and the particles that are actually on our bullet. And then to go take it a step further, we could even give our trail emitter here a separate attribute shading. So if I make a duplicate of that, I could create a new attribute shading that only our trail emitter is affected by, and then give it a different color ramp. I'll pull down my preset here and, you know, maybe choose like a different color scheme for it. Like, that was not quite right. Oops. Maybe like, let's see, purple to yellow perhaps. You know, that's kind of like a very opposite color that I think is kind of cool. And again, we can play with this normalize life a little bit to select more within that range what colors we want. So kind of, I like this dark teal purple. It's a cool effect. And you know, I might decrease this max particles count even further and lower our emission rate a little bit so it doesn't emit as quickly. So you just get a little less and it's more of like this effect lasting afterwards. And what I might do is, because this one's only points and line connections, is looking a little faint, so I might bring the points and lines back up and then lower the trails a bit. So there's a lot of back and forth that you're going to do here, and that's why it's important to kind of visually organize your graph in a way that's really fast to navigate through it and make changes as you go. Right, so I think that looks pretty cool. And you may, again, as you fiddle, like, maybe I want this to spin even faster. Maybe even a little bit more. Oops. What did I do? Control Z. Make this spin a little bit more. There you go. So now it's really spinning. And I think that's a pretty cool effect. I'm going to do a little more fiddling here. Okay, so now, you know, as we layer more things like this trail emitter, we're starting to get a really large amount of complexity And I think it really makes this bullet and this visual stimulus here quite interesting. So now we have our bullet, right? Let's look at our hand. We'll let this bullet reach its end position here. And if we jump back into our orbit camera, we can kind of move our orbit by doing Alt, Shift, and drag. And so I feel like we need to position our hand so that its palm is actually catching this bullet. So if I move this hand down in Y so that the palm is in this region, I think the hand also needs to be a little bit bigger. So maybe I'll double its size right off the bat and move it down even further. Right, so our hand right now, you can see, is actually using some of the same point and line connection renders. I think I'm going to make a new set of these for just our hand mesh emitters. So if I take these two and duplicate them, I can first, in our original two, tell it only render on, I'm going to select both our mesh and trail, only render on the bullet stuff. Oops. Right, you see it just connected those to our rendered emitters here. And then for these two new ones, I want these to only render our hand. And you have to be really careful when you go through, and as you start using rendered emitters or affected emitters, you have to be very specific in telling them, okay, these two new ones only affect the hand. These three original ones only affect this bullet. And within this bullet, only the point and line connection affect the trail, and this trail only affects them, or the point and line connection affect both the mesh and the trail emitters. Whereas this trail render only affects the mesh emitter and not the trail render. So it starts to get a little bit confusing. You can obviously outline some of that in comments, but part of this is just going to be knowing your scene and visually organizing it in a way that is easy to parse through so that people can hover here and figure out, oh, okay, it's these two. Hover over this one, you know, and be like, oh, okay, it's the mesh emitter. So there is inevitably going to be a little bit of digging that's going to happen if you hand any complex particle system file off. But by separating these, you have a lot more control in terms of what you can do per object. You know, so similarly, I might make a new attribute shading for the hand. And again, just remember to be very specific with affected emitters. So let's pick a different color scheme. Maybe this ice preset I have here is kind of cool. And I might shift this again towards like a lighter, brighter tone. We're going a little bright today. And you know, you can see you can spend a lot of time picking colors. It's so much fun. You can make your whole system, then just start playing with colors to see what effect that has on how your scene looks. And so I really picked this color just to get some nice contrast between our hand and our bullet. And again, you know, play with some of these settings to tune within that color curve where you want your attribute shading to sample from. So I wanted some of the teals that are mixed in here. And you can also, again, play with, for instance, polygons, right? Or edges to see what effect that has on appearance. I kind of, again, I really like this vertice thing today. Usually I like polygons, but this I think gives a really clear sense of form. And you know, you can already start to see some cool camera angles we might be able to pick out later. In general, when I animate, I like to sort of construct my scene first before looking at any camera angles or trying to animate those items. So, you know, we have our hand here, and I think when the bullet hits, we want this hand to sort of explode outwards, or else it's kind of boring. So now we can start to look at effectors, right? I think the easiest way to have this hand explode from a center point is to create an effector where the radius slowly expands outwards or quickly expands outwards and causes the hand to explode. So as we're thinking about that effect, like what is the right effector to use, right? You could certainly look at an explode effector. You could also use, I would think, a force effector. I don't think a velocity effector would be the greatest because velocity effectors tend to move at a constant speed, whereas we want a very rapid acceleration and not an instant velocity change because it takes time for these particles to accelerate and reach full speed. So I'm going to just use a force effector. You can certainly try and experiment with other types of effectors. There probably isn't a right answer in a lot of scenarios, just preference. So I'm going to create this force effector, and just a reminder that, again, you have to use the affected emitters if you don't want it to affect other things. So I'm going to link in just our hand for now. And for this force effector, you'll notice that right away you don't see an effect. And part of the issue right now is that our force effector is back here by our origin, whereas our hand is way over here. So how do you now make this force effector a child of this null that you moved way over here? Like, this is already, the particle root is the parent. You can't just make this null the parent of the force effectors. How do you go about doing this? A lot of these effectors have an input called transform node, and these effectors themselves also have like an XYZ information here. So in this scenario, I'm just gonna, because we've only offset in the X, I'm gonna use this position X to have this null also feed into. And you'll see right away that our force effector has been moved to this hand. If you want a bit more control, because once you tie this in, you can't really move this force effector anymore. If you want a bit more control, you can just make another null, right? And basically first route this null into this null, and then feed this null into the position X. And now this lets you offset this force effector a little bit, right, from just the raw value that it has with this hand. So our force effector is now here, and let's see, actually move that. We want to, instead of directional force, we want to repel. And so this force effector should start to repel some of these particles here. Let's see, why is it not? I think the mistake I'm making here is I actually have to use the transform node for this force. I don't think we can just use the position X here as much as I would like to. So it's really good that we made this dummy node, because it lets us reposition this force. And you'll see once I linked it up there, our force now is coming from the center of their hand, kind of where this bullet is hitting, which is very convenient. And a lot of these effectors have a radius here, so we can kind of use this to control how far it affects. So when the bullet first hits, it's not going to affect a very large radius. It's going to start from just the center portion of the palm. So it's going to be very focused in the center here. And then it's going to widen, right, and force the rest of this hand outwards. So we can give this radius a control here. Let's make another envelope modifier. And in this force effector, we can use this envelope modifier to control the radius now. And basically, as this envelope goes from 0 to 1, our radius of this effector is going to grow and affect more and more of this hand. Oh, right, we have to set our ceiling first. So let's say like 10. So that affects the whole hand. So as we modulate this envelope modifier now, it should go from affecting a very small center portion of the hand to affecting a much larger portion. You see already that's really quite cool. So as we modulate that, we can kind of create a center outward explosion effect as the bullet hits. So let's see, we will animate that. We might also want to animate this amount here. So if I give it a ceiling of 100, it's going to be really rapid. We can tie this in, and that way, as the radius grows, the amount of force also grows, and I think it'll be a nice effect there. It's like that. You can really feel the explosion now, right? Cool. So let's rename this envelope modifier to hand explode. And that'll be a useful control in a moment when we keyframe that. So if we look at timing this explosion of this hand with this bullet, we can jump back to our curve editor here. And obviously right here is kind of when the bullet hits. So similarly, at this point here, we could probably start having this hand explode ramp up. So we'll drop a keyframe at 0, and then we'll move forward sometime and then drop a keyframe at 1. And it's not showing on our curve editor right now because this S for solo is only showing our bullet movement. If we click this S for hand explode, it'll show both, and we kind of see how they relate. I use Control Alt and drag to kind of move around or to zoom on this curve editor. If you Control Alt and drag left and right, it kind of zooms in time. And if you Control Alt drag up and down, it kind of zooms in this value height. So you can use both together to sort of reframe this, and then Alt click and drag to move and pan. So we can kind of get a better idea of how this is timed. And if we want, we could just play it once from start to finish and see, does this explosion time correctly? Right, so I would say it explodes a little late there. And so some shortcuts I start to use now is if you select a keyframe, you can use Alt and then left and right to bump it in time. And I think that's a really handy tool for quickly being able to move these without necessarily needing to use your mouse. You can also use your mouse by Alt click and dragging. If you don't hold Alt, it'll only drag the value even if you drag left and right. So you definitely want to make sure that you use the right shortcuts here in the curve editor. So I feel like this could almost start a little bit sooner. So as this comes in, our hand explodes basically. So, you know, it probably needs a little bit of finessing, but our element of control there is at least. One thing that's kind of odd is right now this bullet stops right when it hits the hand. I think we want our bullet to overshoot a little bit. So we can move this up past 1 and it'll basically move past the final point that we've set. And I think if we shift this in time a little later as well, it'll feel like the bullet's really traveling through the hand and causing it to explode. So we could probably even move this even later. So let me back up a little bit further. Right, so that feels a little more natural. However, bullets still exist. We kind of want this bullet to disappear, right, and these particles to fade off. So let's make a control for that. You know, so as you can see in terms of particle complexity, when you start animating the system you've made, you have to make controls for the animation and the sort of storyboarded sequence that you need to do. And if we need this bullet to disappear right away, you should know that you need to basically decrease your emission rates of your bullet. So if we link this to emission rate from 1 to 0, I'll change this to multiply and rename this. I'll call this bullet visibility. And we're gonna have to keyframe this as well, right? So if we jump back here, as this bullet moves through, we want this bullet visibility to go from fully visible, oops, not question mark, K. Let me jump forward in time a little bit to not invisible, but to stop emitting, right? So if we solo that as well, now we can see where this bullet starts to fade off. And so as our bullet flies through, it should stop emitting particles, and that works, but our line work still shows for this, this bullet object itself. So we could use the same bullet visibility, and here you can start to see why using modifiers is so powerful if you want to control, right, more than one parameter, like I mentioned in the other tutorial. We can go into our 3D object here and tie this bullet visibility also to our lines alpha. And what'll happen is as the particles fade off and stop emitting, our bullet will also fade. And you'll see there's a little bit of timing issue there. I think we need this to start fading a little bit earlier and maybe fade away quite quickly, actually. I think that'll do the trick. So you can see that that looks a little bit more natural right off the bat. I think that as we get in here and this bullet fades, this might even have to be a little bit more gradual, and this bullet might have to move a little further than that. So it really feels like the momentum is carrying on. Let's see, this could probably go a little bit further even. And you'll notice right now that all our keyframes are quite linear, and that's probably contributing to some of our issues here in terms of making this look natural. To be honest, I actually don't prefer the default interpolation that Notch uses, which is TCB. I typically like to use Bezier because it gives me handles and some control of the curve of these from a visual perspective. I'm also not a huge fan of the way Bezier curves work at this moment in time, but hopefully that'll change in the future. I've already made some feature requests. Hopefully those will be implemented soon to be more like After Effects and Cinema, which is really what I'm used to and what I would imagine most motion designers are used to as you start keyframing. So you'll notice when we added this Bezier, it kind of has more of like an easing in and out. And so all these movements are going to have more of like what I consider momentum, and it's going to help this scene look a little more organic and natural. You may have to retime a couple things, and if you want to set Bezier as your default, you can right click here and change your default key interpolation from TCP to Bezier. That's typically something I will do. You know, the colors here, if you ever get confused, you can expand these and it'll tell you which color is what. So our hand explode, I think, needs to happen a little more quickly. So I'm going to shift that keyframe forward. Or actually, maybe too quickly. I think it needs to happen later, but quickly still. Ooh, too late. So, you know, this is where keyframing comes in. You're just going to have to go back and forth and figure out what the right timing is for your scene. So this needs to happen even earlier. A little better. Not quite. I think this kind of needs to have this sort of upward arc. It needs to start suddenly and kind of ease off in this explosion. And I think we also need these particles to stop emitting from the hand. So similar to this bullet visibility control we have, we also need to make a hand visibility. And at this point in time, I would say that you kind of have the tools you need to make complex particle systems. I'm going to continue on and kind of finish out this tutorial to match, you know, our intended goal. And there's going to be a little bit of like tuning and thought process in here that you're welcome to watch. But, you know, if you're short on time, I would say this next portion is probably not as useful to you if you're just focused on layering particle systems and how to segment emitters, renders, effectors, attribute shaders so that you can layer many things into a single particle root. But I'm going to continue on here, so stick around if you're interested. Hand visibility, I'm going to tie this into mesh emitter, this emission rate here. And, you know, again, normal value is going to be 1. So after the bullet hits here and this thing explodes, I kind of want it to stop emitting. So I'm going to keyframe a 1 and then keyframe a 0. And I'm going to show it here so we can see it's this also green curve. I find sometimes the color choices aren't super helpful, but hey. So as this bullet hits the hand should basically explode and stop emitting. So I think that looks quite nice right now, actually, right? So this bullet flies through, hits the hand explodes, the bullet fades off. The bullet might even fade a little bit late now. So I think we can move some of this up in time a little bit. I think this could start fading off even sooner. I might want the hand to emit for a little bit longer than where it's at now. I think that looks pretty nice. We play from start to finish. Right, we have our bullet fly in, hit our hand explodes, our bullet fades off. So this is really great. If we switch back to our 6 camera, we can see our bullet gets fired, it starts, it's got all these cool particles and it hits the hand, it explodes, and everything fades off. So right away we have this animation sequence that I would think is pretty cool. You know, we can get into a little stuff here like fine details just to add a little bit of dynamicness to it and make it a little more visually engaging. One thing that I think is really important is kind of like pace. So right now everything is just one linear speed. The bullet gets shot, it's the same speed as it flies, it hits the hand, everything just happens in this sort of boring linear flow. If you look at traditional motion design, what makes these things really interesting is having like something that's really fast and then it slows down. You have a slow motion section where you can really let the viewer take in the detail of what's happening, and then you take them back out by speeding it back up and continuing your scene. And it's really powerful because you can think of it like curve frame easing. It creates interest, right? Things in life don't happen all at the same speed. You have things that happen seemingly very quickly, and then you have moments of seemingly slow-mo where in movies and VFX, it creates a lot of interest and creates a lot of tension, right, and suspense. And I think that is really the key to making good animation and motion design and making it that much more interesting. So one way that I think is a really good way to do that is to segment kind of your action that's happening here into a few different sections. I think what I want to do is basically, as the bullet gets fired, it should be very quick, right? When guns get shot or bullets get fired, it's a very sudden thing. So this animation should have a very fast start. And then I think it would be kind of engaging to have a slow-mo section in the middle as the bullet's flying, so you can take in all the detail of this complex particle system you've made. And then it should speed up at the very end when it hits this hand and has this grand finale and has this impact, right? Again, a very sudden thing. So we kind of want to have this fast ramp in, a slow-mo section in the middle, and then a fast ramp out. And this gets into some of the speed control things that I've seen a lot of people struggling with as they're starting out in Notch. And one thing in particle systems that I think is really helpful to control this is actually this fixed update rate. If we play with this a little bit, if I make this a low number, you'll notice that the simulation happens very quickly, right? Everything is very fast. And if I make this a very large number, like 180, I start over, everything's going to happen very slow, right? The way that the particles move is going to be much slower, you can see. So I think this fixed update frame is a great way to kind of control your particle simulation speed. And I think this is a really great tool for creating essentially slow-mo sequences where not only your camera animation and bullet animation slow down, but your actual simulation rate also slows down. It's a tool I've used a lot in some of the particle animations I make. And I think it's really what gives it that extra bit of interest and suspense, like I was saying. So let's also make a control for this. Or we'll have an envelope modifier that goes from 0 to 1. And we probably don't want to bring this all the way down to 0. And we want to be able to modulate that. So this is one of those scenarios where I would go beyond just an envelope modifier, maybe look at a range remap. What a range remap is, it remaps an input value to an output value. So right now, if I make my range remap have a value of 1, this multiply is basically going to modulate that 1 from 0 to 1. And so the in right now matches a default, which is 0 to 1. But I want the out to modulate this particle root 180. So I might also make this range remap a multiply. And if I link this up, or actually I have to double click this and do it. For some reason that one won't link with that shortcut. If I link this to fixed update rate there. So what this is doing is when range remap has a value of 1, it's basically the slowest that the simulation will happen. So I think of this as kind of like a slow-mo control. And when the minimum range remap I want to do is maybe like 0.1. I don't want it to go all the way to 0. So when this is 0, this whole animation should play back at a relatively fast speed. And when this is 1, this animation should play back in kind of slow-mo. And then you can modulate this 180 to be even higher if you want like even greater slow-mo effect. I think 300 might be a bit too high, so I'll stick to 180. And now I can use the slow-mo control to kind of modulate any slow motion in this animation to make it a bit more interesting. So in our curve editor, let's first modulate how this bullet flies towards the hand. So right now this bullet's flying kind of in this X trajectory. And you can see it's this very sort of linear path or it's not so linear anymore because we have this curve. It starts slow and then kind of gains momentum, travels at a constant speed until it hits the hand and then slows down. So we can now play with this curve editor and kind of, if we solo just that, we can focus on the bullet speed and segment this into essentially 3 sections: the entry, the slow-mo section, and then the exit. So if we add some keyframes here, by default they're Bezier because I've changed my default, we can now kind of create this first entry section. And when you look at a curve editor, this is basically the like velocity in a way. So I want this to come in with kind of a bang and start fast. And then I want it to like slow down and then level out into our slow motion section. I also don't want this slope to hit 0 during this keyframe, because that means our bullet has completely stopped. I just want it to slow down. So if I play that right now, you can see that our bullet starts fast, slows down, right, as it enters this section. And then I'll use this next Bezier to kind of also not be non-zero, so our bullet has some amount of velocity in this region. So this slope is our bullet velocity on this path during this slow-mo section. I want this to be slower than the entry or the exit, right? So the bullet should come in fast, slow down for a moment, almost a bit more, I would say. Come in fast, slow down for a moment so that you can take in the detail. And at the end here, it should speed up and blast through our hand. And you'll notice our timing is a bit off, so we'll have to go back and adjust that. But here, we should basically have the speed ramp up. And at the end, I don't want it to slow down. I actually want it to speed up and kind of blow all the way through. So use the slope as a guide. You see we kind of made like a S-curve here, a reverse S-curve. So it fast, 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 slow, then fast, fast, fast. So as we play this, it should go fast, 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 slow. Right, so we'll do some stuff here, and then it should end fast as it blasts through the hand. So right there, we've created kind of this dynamic nature, and I think that already looks pretty good. Not bad for a first pass, and it never hurts to like do some more tuning in here and get it more perfect. Like for instance, if I want this slow-mo section to be a little bit closer to the hand, I can just take these two keyframes and kind of move it up. And you'll probably have to play with some of these Bezier curves here to get it to behave correctly again. It's like this is now too steep. There you go. So it'll go really fast. Then we'll get this slow-mo right before it hits the hand. And then it'll blast through the hand at the end. So I might tone this back a tiny bit. So you can already start to see the suspense that this makes. Like this bullet's traveling really quick. And then you have the slow-mo section right before it hits the hand, kind of like Neo Matrix bullet time sort of thing. And this is where our earlier control that we made for the slow-mo really comes into play. We can take the slow-mo control now and have our particle simulation slow down as this bullet slows down as well. So let's keyframe this parameter now. If we hit K for at 0, it should be kind of playing maximum speed, right? And then right around here is where we want this to start slowing down. So we'll bring this up to say like, oh, I don't know, let's just shoot for 1 and we can adjust this later. So in this scenario, we want the slope to almost be the reverse, because we want this bullet to be fast and then it'll suddenly hit the slow-mo section, at which point it should be slow for some amount of time. And then when it speeds up again, we want this slow-mo to stop being slow-mo and for the bullet to return to normal speed. Maybe not all the way, but you know, a little bit like that. So this particle system will kind of go really fast, then it'll slow down and it'll speed up again at the end. So if we go back to our camera, we might be able to see this effect a little better. So that's kind of cool. Everything happens really quickly. I might even nudge. A good shortcut is Control left and right. That'll jump you between keyframes on the layer that you have selected. Since these overlap, I only want the slow-mo. So if I use Control while I have the slow-mo selected, it'll select that keyframe, and I can use Alt to nudge it. Alt Shift, or that didn't do what I thought it would do, never mind, just Alt and nudge. So it'll start fast, then our slow-mo section starts here, so we also want to nudge these two keyframes a little bit later here, right? Nope. Starts fast, 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 then it slows down as it does this animation portion, and it'll speed up again at the very end. So, you know, now we're tying together slowing down or speeding up our keyframes with also speeding up or slowing down our particle simulation. So you can see that gives this like really cool effect. I almost don't slow it down quickly enough actually. So still not quickly enough. Seems like it's got to be really sudden. That's still not sudden enough. Let's see. Let me expand this time a little bit so I can better see what's going on. I think maybe this needs to be a slower ramp. Let's see. I think this might be not slow enough, actually. So I'm going to go back into my particle root and just increase our fixed update rate. That wasn't quite right either, I think. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of fiddling that needs to happen here. And this is why motion design takes so long. It's hard to get it to feel right. And sometimes you just have to spend some time and play with it and find some parameters that help you get it closer towards feeling right. I think this parent transform weight might be a little too strong in some of these. Something tells me that might be the case here. So let me decrease this a little bit. Even a little bit less. Let me make sure that this is having the effect that I'm hoping for. Fixed update rate. You know, I'm going to change this because it's hard to tell right now. I'm going to change this to a replace. And we're going to go from 10 to 240. So now I don't have to worry about seeing what this is. I just know when this is 0, it's 10, and then when it's 1, it's 240. I think that'll make it a little easier to modulate. So I think I'm going to turn off this parent transform weight. I don't actually want these particles to sort of follow the bullet as it's been doing. I want them to just leave this trail. And I think that looks a little bit better. And if we give it a little bit of emission velocity, they should emit with a little bit more velocity based on the direction that this thing is spinning. So you can see here that this is really cool. And as we slow it down, you see a lot more detail in what's happening. I think I can tone back my normal velocity a little bit because it's spreading out a little far now. I think that looks really nice. So let's bring back a little more of these trails. Maybe a little bit more. Let's see. There you go. That's a pretty cool effect. You can really see the way that this bullet is spinning as it travels. These particles come out and leave some trails. And then, you know, for the slow-mo here, we'll just make sure that it really hits the slow-mo at the perfect time. Like right when it's kind of hitting this slow-mo section, we should already be in particle slow-mo mode. You can almost start it a little bit earlier for just extra effect. And the more sharp this curve is, the more sudden it's going to feel as you hit the slow-mo. So that was almost a little bit too sudden. So fast, 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 then slow-mo shot. And then we can speed up again once we hit this hand. So let's retime our hand a little bit because I think that has had some impact, this hand explode here. So our bullet's going, and then our bullet disappears too early. Right, hand visibility here. Or not hand visibility, we want bullet visibility, there we go. So it disappears a little bit too quickly. I think this could move towards the end a little bit faster. Slow, slow, slow. And then our hand explodes a little too early. So we should shift this a tiny bit later here. So I think that looks pretty good actually. I might want our camera to keep moving a little bit at the end here. So I might add another keyframe after this because we want that, we like that final position, but we want our camera just to keep drifting a little. And we'll just match these slopes so that it kind of, camera keeps going and slows down. So we play that from start to finish. I think we're getting a pretty good effect here. And I noticed that as our hand explodes, let's take a look at just that real quick. As our hand explodes, it explodes a little uniformly, so we can add a little bit of randomness in our force effector here. And I think that'll help it look a little more organic, you could say. So our bullet comes in, hits our hand, and you can see it shatters much more. And I think that looks pretty good. I'm gonna take this even a step further. I know this is getting quite long, but for those of you interested in seeing, some more animation, I think we can play with our camera moves a little bit and make this a bit more interesting, because right now our camera is so linear and just from this perspective that I think we can do a lot more with it and make this more interesting. So with our camera here, I'm gonna control like a position Z. So I'm gonna give this envelope modifier called cam distance. And we'll tie this into our position Z here. And then I also want to make a control for cam rotation. Call it cam rotation heading. I want the camera to kind of spin around this bullet. So I'll connect this to our heading here. And again, I'm going to set kind of maximums. So at most, I probably don't want to go over a 360 rotation. And I'm just going to remember to change these both to multiply. And then for our camera distance, right, I probably want, like, let me set maximums first. So I want our camera to, probably no more than -10. And I think that'll give it quite a cool effect. So let's look at keyframing some camera moves. This is fun. So I always put our camera in a null so that it stays focused on the null or the center of your scene. For these camera moves, I'm going to animate this kind of camera distance first, or camera rotation first. So I kind of want it to look at this bullet from like a straight on view, perhaps. So 0.75 here is where we get this straight on look. So our bullet kind of shoots at us. And then maybe we'll have, let me keyframe that. We'll have our camera kind of spin around once you hit this slow-mo section, right, to the side. Or let's go the other way. So to 1 here. And let's go ahead, let's remove these other ones except for, like, let's look at bullet movement because we know where the bullet is, and coordinate our camera moves against that. So right now we've got this camera that starts from a front on and then rotates to the side. And I think it should rotate all the way around to the back as you hit this last section here. So we're going to go 1.25. So that'll rotate around the bullet as you hit your hand and end this cool explosion. I think that's a really nice effect. So you'll notice because we keyframe this Bezier, this middle section is flat, so our camera completely stops. And I think you lose a little bit of interest there. We want our camera to keep moving just a little bit slower. So I'm gonna add another keyframe and then do kind of what we did with our bullet position and give these, just a little bit of slope to keep the camera moving. Like it can slow down, but not completely stop. And I think that's another really important principle in motion graphics is I don't feel anything should ever really stop. It should just slow down or speed up. At the end here, we can obviously have it end on this sort of cool, not profile, but straight on shot where we just get this full on explosion. And I think that almost happened a little too late there. So it almost kind of snaps into place a little too quickly for my taste, I think. It needs to be a little smoother there. So slow-mo. And then our end shot. So that's already a little better. I might move both of these up a little further like that. So my recommendation is if you want to do some keyframing, get comfortable with your curve editor. That's going to be everything as you start doing camera moves. The faster you can get on the curve editor, the more comfortable you can get with editing curves, the more compelling your animations will look as you work through it and iterate. You know, so like now that we have a rotation, I might start looking at our camera distance, right? Maybe we have our camera start quite a bit closer, get some detail going on in this bullet. So let's show our camera rotation, camera distance, and our bullet movement to coordinate that. So start really close. Then as we get to the slow-mo section, maybe I want to pull the camera out a little bit. And so that's our yellow line. So we play that real quick. You can see that's already starting to look really cool. And then this end section, I might pull the camera out, just keep the camera pulling out so it doesn't ever stop, right? So here I want to give this a little bit of a slope. And I might, you know, similar to the way the bullet starts suddenly, I might want our camera to pull out quickly as this bullet gets fired. You know, I actually don't like the way that's going. I think I'm going to flip this. I'm going to have our camera start out far, then get close to our bullet, and then move back out far. And I think that's a much more compelling motion, right? It feels like we're where the hand is, right? We're looking at this from the perspective of the hand. This bullet's getting shot at us. We're zooming in, kind of catching this slow-mo flyby real quick, and then zooming back out as it goes on and hits this hand. So it's almost like we, in a sense, we dodged a bullet. I'm gonna bring this in really close, see what that looks like. Oh yeah, I think that's cool. So again, you know, if you're gonna put in all this work adding detail to your particle scene, make sure that you put in the time doing camera moves so that the viewer can really catch all this detail and get captivated in the suspense that you have here, you know. Obviously, like I still need to smooth some of this keyframing out a little bit. It kind of snaps in here at the end without camera movement. So I think we can use this unison of distance pull out and camera rotation to smooth that out a tiny bit. So it doesn't quite meld there. Screen one. Let's see, camera distance, camera rotation. Right, so this one can probably happen a little more gradually. So more fiddle, 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 fiddle. I think we can pull our camera even closer here, actually. I think that's gonna do the trick for us. don't think our camera needs to pull out quite as far. I think we can kind of follow this bullet closely. And because we've made the bullet kind of the parent to our camera, it's really easy to have the camera follow this bullet. And I think that was a very advantageous move in the initial section. So I'm realizing I kind of want this bullet to finish its full spin around before the slow-mo accelerates again. So we get the slow-mo, 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 finish spinning around, and then kind of wrap up its spin around the bullet as it flies through the hand. So I think that looks quite nice. I might even just delete this keyframe, have it finish this full spin as it's in the slow-mo section. Doesn't feel quite right, so just keep fiddling. I mean, that's pretty much it. And at this point, you can look into tuning some of your post effects, things like film grading. Maybe toning this glow a little bit because I see some blowout in certain sections. I'm gonna call that pretty close to good. I mean, this is really similar to the example I showed you. It obviously isn't the exact same. I think you can spend a lot more time fiddling with this and kind of getting it closer to the result that you personally would be happy with. Obviously, every project, if you really care about the project, every project is going to be limited on time. You can spend an infinite amount of time making this cooler, adding more layers, doing more with it, but at some point you're going to have to cut short your time and just make sure you have a deliverable. So making these modifiers is going to make it much easier for you to go back through, make changes, make iterations, that sort of thing. So, just be really conscious as you construct these files to make your job easier down the road so that you can make really good animation and impress your clients with this work. So I'm going to call that good, So here's our final product as we play it through. I think this is a really compelling animation with a lot of suspense. We have a system that layers quite a few items with multiple emitters, multiple attribute shading, effectors, and renderers. And we've kind of made a cohesive scene with good visual direction. I hope that wasn't too confusing or too fast. I kind of went through a lot there, and this tutorial got really long-winded. But I kind of wanted, it's hard to go into the complexity of this without making something interesting and without going over a lot of these other things that go into motion design and making something that's really cool. There's no reason to make a scene complex if you don't have good control of it and control that makes it interesting. So I hope this was helpful. And again, I'm happy to do follow-up tutorials where we expand on some of the stuff we went over here. Things like keyframing, I think could use a longer session on. Organization, I'm pretty happy with. You can obviously make particle systems even more complex. There's lots of other nodes in particle systems that I didn't even really go over here, but are useful and I use all the time. The Notch manual is a really great resource for learning more about those. Like showing metrics as you're developing this is really handy. And just make sure you turn that off when you go for your final render, right? So if we compare this to the thing that I made and spent quite a bit more time on, I'd say we hit the nail pretty close, right? We sort of made the same bullet speed and blowout effect at the end. I think I added another slow-mo section at the very end there. I think I finessed some of these trails a little bit more so it's more clear, and then the colors are a little different. I would say my glow is almost too much in this initial one. And I kind of like making things from scratch because you'll get a different result each time. It's a really great way to make iterations and play with the variables to see what you might get. You might stumble upon something new and get a completely different result. And that's the main reason why I don't like working from bins and templates is you get often tunneled into making the same thing over and over again and just trying to make, as I'm finding out, this same scene twice right now. I'm getting very different results and I don't hate either. They're just different. So, learn your particle systems well. Learn how you can control them well and make sure you give yourself enough time to iterate and fiddle with it so that you can get it to a point where you're happy with the result. That's it. I think I'm going to end it there. And, thanks for watching. Really appreciate all the support I've been getting so far, and I look forward to making more of these tutorials. So take care. I look forward to seeing some of the really cool stuff that you guys make. Until next time.